April 14, 1943. 30,000 feet above the cold gray sweep of the North Sea, on a stair of thin air where wind feels like stone and the breath in your lungs is a rumor. In the cockpit of de Havilland Mosquito MM420, Squadron Leader John Jack R. Thompson tightened his gloves until the leather creaked. The canopy fogged briefly with his exhale, then cleared as the twin Rolls-Royce Merlins behind him settled into a smooth, urgent howl. Two living things stitched to a fuselage of wood and glue that shivered with every throttle change. Thompson's fingers hovered over the throttles. Beside him, Flight Lieutenant Albert Davies leaned forward in the navigator's seat, map clipped, astroscope folded away. The instrument panel glowed faintly in the dawn. Altimeter, manifold pressures, oil temp, precise, utilitarian. The Mosquito's soul was a simple marriage of light structure and complex power. Outside, the black tips of the propellers cut the air in arcs that were almost invisible. The plywood shell around them flexed with each revolution in a way that would have seemed grotesque to a metal-minded engineer. But to these men it felt honest and terribly promising. A chill ran through the cockpit as the fuselage settled into its cruise. The smell was not of metal and new paint, but of varnish and glue, of cedar and birch and the faint lingering tang of machine oil. Somewhere aft on the wooden skin, you could hear the almost domestic sound of adhesive settling. Not the warlike roar pilots were bred to expect, but a quiet creak that made the Mosquito feel like a racing boat in the sky. Wind 0. Cloud layer broken at 20,000, Davies murmured, voice low and precise. He tapped a pencil against the map, inked crosshairs showing the route. Low, fast, surgical. This was a reconnaissance run. Cameras tucked beneath the belly, an exacting window for a few high-value photographs over enemy territory. The brief was clean, in, up to photograph, out before the fighters finished waking. On the ground, German test engineers in their gray laboratories had laughed at photographs of the prototype. Holzfliegs, they called it, wooden flyer, and in the hangars the nickname the Wooden Wonder was passed around like a joke. How could plywood stand up to cannon shells? How could thin layers of glue and timber compete with the cold steel of a Messerschmitt or a Focke-Wulf? The laughter meant something in the Reich's factories. It was certainty, measured and smug. Up here, though, that certainty thinned like the air. Thompson relaxed his shoulders. He could feel the Mosquito's balance the way a violinist feels the resonance of a string. Push too hard and it screeches, too soft, and it loses voice. He trimmed the rudder slightly. The aircraft responded like a thoroughbred sensing the spur. The altimeter needle trembled and held. The twin engines, rated and tuned, produced something the Luftwaffe's mockers had not accounted for. Raw, immediate acceleration that translated wood and glue into speed. The Mosquito climbed, taut and light, and the clouds below rolled away like a theater curtain revealing the coast. Eyes on portbow, Davies said, quietly insistent. He had the prime lenses. His face was a paper map of concentration. Thompson scanned. For a long, breathless second there was nothing but the pale curve of sea, and then a black dot on the horizon resolving into a formation of bombers and, closer, a scatter of fighters. Messerschmitt Bf-109s lean and glinting, their noses tipped with oil and arrogance. Their pilots were young men in leather helmets, mouths tight as they tuned their guns, their engineers certain of the outcome. Metal would beat wood, always. But there is a thing in aviation that no drawing office tally can predict. Momentum with a light structure, and a designer who trusted wood to be more than cheap. Geoffrey de Havilland and his test pilots had argued not for invulnerability, but for a different calculus. A craft that could climb, accelerate, and escape in ways heavy metal could not. The Luftwaffe sneers did not account for that mixture of power and weight. The Merlins sang and the Mosquito answered. Thompson thumbed the radio mic. Coastal Control Mosquito MM420. Cameras live. We'll be in and out in 2 passes. Keep us clear. Static answered, thin and obedient. The words felt ceremonial. The real conversation was between man and machine. A subtle exchange of trust, a steady hand and a structure that refused to be small. Below, the coastline was a patchwork of gray fields and dark hedgerows. The bomber formation drifted like a careless shoal. The Messerschmitts were climbing to intercept, their silhouettes sharpening with the sunlight. Thompson dipped the nose, eyes squinting at the sea line, at the instruments that removed nothing of the risk. He felt the Mosquito's acceleration like a promise. Press the throttle and the world thinned to speed. The first pass would be the test. Cameras would click. The enemy would blink. If caught, they'd have the Merlin's power and the Mosquito's agility to trust. The mockery on the ground could wait. Up here, in the thin cold where plywood and courage met, the aircraft behaved like an accusation, the kind that asked the Luftwaffe to explain itself. A shadow crossed the sunlit sea and grew. The Messerschmitts had spotted them. The chase was on. Thompson's jaw set. He folded his fingers over the control column, feeling the subtle feedback through wood-stiffened structure and metal hinge. He smelled the tang of fuel. He tasted the cold. For a moment, the smallest moment, the world was nothing but the throbbing of two Merlins and the small, confident breath of a frame that had not yet been believed. The Messerschmitts were closing fast, 4 dark needles against the pale French horizon, sliding down from altitude in perfect formation. Their Daimler-Benz engines roared, contrails etching sharp lines across the morning sky. To any observer below, it might have looked inevitable. German precision swooping down on a British intruder, the hunter about to crush the fragile thing of wood and canvas. But inside the Mosquito's cockpit, Squadron Leader Thompson felt none of that inevitability, only the hard weight of adrenaline and the peculiar calm that came with danger. He pushed the throttles forward until the Merlin screamed, not a panicked sound but a wild, liberated one. The whole wooden fuselage thrummed, vibrating with a force that felt alive. "Bandits, 4 o'clock high, closing." Davy's voice cut through the intercom, clipped and steady. His hand was already tightening the straps around the camera housing, keeping the delicate glass lenses steady against the shuddering frame. "They've seen us." "Good," Thompson muttered, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Let them try." He pushed the control column forward and banked sharply to port. The Mosquito dove, not falling but slicing, wings tight, fuselage trembling with aerodynamic tension. The altimeter spun. Airspeed climbed. 200, 300, 400 miles per hour. The nose leveled, the world blurred, and suddenly the Mosquito wasn't prey anymore. The Messerschmitts dove after them, but they could not keep up. Their metal frames bit the air too sharply, their weight dragging them into an uncontrolled descent. The Mosquito's light, bonded wood absorbed the pressure, flexing instead of fighting it. Where aluminum might have warped or rivets popped, the Mosquito's skin merely bent and sprang back, like a living thing. At sea level, the aircraft roared over the whitecaps, leaving vapor trails that skimmed the water's surface. Salt spray flashed against the underbelly. The Merlins howled. Thompson pulled up slightly, hugging the terrain, using every ridge and valley to scatter radar contact. Behind him, the Messerschmitts struggled to match the pace, their engines over-revving, their pilots cursing into their oxygen masks. 1109. Overeager, dove too steeply and clipped the air density wrong. Its wing shuddered, just for a moment, before tearing off in a flutter of metal shards. It spiraled down into the sea, a brief orange bloom marking the end of certainty. "Christ almighty," Davies breathed. "You see that?" Thompson didn't answer. He was smiling, not in triumph but in recognition. This was what de Havilland had built for. Not brute endurance, not armor, but grace under impossible pressure. The radio hissed to life. A German voice crackled through the static. One of the Messerschmitt pilots, his tone incredulous and clipped. "Was ist das? Holzflugzeug? Es läuft weg!" "What is that?" "A wooden plane. It's getting away." Thompson laughed, low and sharp. "That's right, old boy," he muttered under his breath. "The wooden plane just outran your fancy metal toy." They climbed again, steady and controlled, until they reached the thin air at 25,000 feet. The horizon stretched forever, the morning sun painting the Mosquito's varnished skin with gold. Davies leaned back, letting out a slow breath. "We've got the shots," he said, nodding toward the camera. "Everything we need." Thompson's response was quiet. "Then let's bring it home." He banked west, heading for England. The Merlins purred in perfect unison, the hum of balance and purpose. Behind them, the Luftwaffe fighters gave up the chase, their pilots no longer seeing prey but a ghost. Something impossible. Later, in the mess hall back at RAF Whiten, the ground crew would gather around the returning Mosquito, eyes wide as they ran hands along its smooth, seamless wooden skin. No bullet holes. No battle scars. just the scent of warm varnish and exhaust. And as Thompson climbed down from the cockpit, he could already hear the laughter, soft, disbelieving, and proud. The kind of laughter that said, "We told them so." Yet across the channel in the laboratories of the Reich, that same laughter was gone. German engineers began testing new designs, trying to understand what they had dismissed, how something built from spruce, balsa, and glue could outrun every machine they'd trusted. They would tear apart captured mosquito wrecks, measuring every joint and curve, but they would never truly understand that this wasn't just a plane. It was philosophy in flight, a rebellion against weight and convention. The Mosquito had proved that speed, not armor, was survival, and in that moment it began rewriting the laws of aerial war. Years before squadron leader Thompson's flight over the North Sea, long before the Mosquito had a name or a silhouette, a man stood in a quiet hangar in Hatfield, England, sketching on a scrap of paper. Geoffrey de Havilland, slight and thoughtful, his spectacles catching the lamplight, was surrounded not by the clatter of rivets or the clang of steel, but by the soft rasp of sandpaper and the scent of varnish. It was 1938, a time when the world teetered on the edge of war, and the Royal Air Force believed in one thing above all: armor. Heavy bombers, thick-skinned and slow, packed with gunners and machine guns. The Air Ministry wanted fortresses in the sky, metal beasts that could trade fire with the Luftwaffe and survive. But de Havilland disagreed. He looked at the numbers: weight, lift, drag, power, and saw something else. Every gun added mass. Every ounce of armor slowed the climb. The sky, he believed, rewarded not the heaviest, but the fastest, and so he made a proposal that bordered on heresy. What if the bomber had no guns at all? In the first meeting with the Air Ministry, the reaction was almost theatrical. The senior officers laughed. A wooden aircraft, no guns? Plywood instead of armor? The very idea sounded like a schoolboy's dream. One officer had leaned forward, incredulous. "You want to send men into German airspace unarmed? In a wooden aircraft?" De Havilland's answer was calm. "They won't need guns if nothing can catch them." Silence followed. It was the kind of silence that comes when a man has said something both foolish and profound. Undeterred, de Havilland retreated to his workshops. If no one would commission it, he'd build it anyway. He gathered his engineers, men and women, many of them furniture makers and boat builders, people who understood wood not as weakness, but as an art form. They experimented with layers of birch, spruce, and balsa, bonded with casein and formaldehyde adhesives in a sandwich of strength and lightness. It was craftsmanship disguised as engineering. Every part of the Mosquito was designed with an elegance that bordered on audacity. Its smooth, rivetless skin reduced drag dramatically. Its twin Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same hearts that powered the Spitfire, gave it over 400 horsepower each. And because it lacked the weight of armor and gun turrets, the Mosquito could cruise faster than a fighter and climb higher than most interceptors. The first prototype, 4050, took to the air on November 25, 1940, from the grass runway at Hatfield. Geoffrey's son, Geoffrey Jr., sat in the cockpit. No guns, no escort, just 2 Merlins and a skeleton of timber. The aircraft rolled, lifted, and, to the astonishment of every skeptic, soared. At 20,000 feet, she was already faster than the Spitfire. At 30,000, she left the Hurricanes behind entirely. Within months, the British press would call it the Wooden Wonder. The name stuck. By 1941, the first production Mosquitoes were being fitted for reconnaissance, carrying cameras instead of bombs. They could photograph Berlin in daylight and be back over the channel before the German fighters even scrambled. Then came the bomber variants, light and surgical, capable of striking Gestapo headquarters, radar installations and railway hubs with breathtaking precision. Each mission was a gamble. No armor, no guns, only faith in speed. But again and again they proved the impossible. Losses were lower than any comparable bomber squadron. Even as British crews grew to trust her, the Luftwaffe fumed. Their engineers dissected downed Mosquitoes and shook their heads at the craftsmanship. There were no metal ribs to weld, no rivets to pry. Everything was bonded, organic, seamless. One German engineer, after examining a captured fuselage, was said to have muttered, "It is not an aircraft. It is a miracle." But the real miracle wasn't the material. It was the mindset. De Havilland had built not a bomber, but an idea. That innovation in wartime didn't come from more armor or bigger guns, but from daring to defy logic. In the years to come, that philosophy would turn the Mosquito into the RAF's most versatile weapon. A bomber, a night fighter, a pathfinder, even a transport for secret agents. It would strike fear not through destruction, but through elegance. And across occupied Europe, civilians would look up at the high, thin contrails and whisper, "The ghost has come again." The Germans tried to design something that could catch it. The Me-262 jet, the FW-190 Dora. But for most of the war, the Mosquito simply outran history. Its legend began not with a dogfight, but with a man who refused to believe that strength only came in metal. February 18, 1943, night over Germany, black as oil, cold as a grave. The de Havilland Mosquito BMKR-4, tailcode DZ597, tore through the upper darkness at 360 miles per hour. Below, the city of Berlin sprawled under a thin haze of cloud and smoke, its lights hidden by blackout curtains, its searchlights probing the sky like pale, frantic fingers. Inside the cockpit, Flight Lieutenant Ted Sizemore checked his stopwatch, his voice calm but taut. 30 seconds to drop. Beside him, the pilot, Squadron Leader Ian Harris, didn't reply. His jaw was clenched tight, hands locked around the control column as the Mosquito rode a current of turbulent air. The bomb bay held only 4 500-pounders, tiny compared to the massive payloads of a Lancaster, but this raid wasn't about destruction. It was about humiliation. Tonight, 2 Mosquitoes were crossing the heart of Germany in broad daylight, tasked with bombing the capital during a live broadcast of Hermann Göring's speech to the German people. Göring, the proud architect of the Luftwaffe, had once declared with absolute confidence, "No enemy aircraft will ever fly over the Reich." And yet, even as he spoke those words, the faint hum of twin Merlins approached Berlin from the northwest. "Target ahead," Sizemore said, voice tight. The glow of the city's defensive fires bled through the clouds, orange and sickly. "On the mark. Now." Harris flicked the release. 4 small shadows dropped away into the night. Seconds later, the horizon flashed white, then red. A perfect, deliberate detonation. Not mass carnage, not industrial ruin, but precision. A message written in light and sound. "We can reach you whenever we wish." As they turned for home, flak erupted, black bursts exploding at impossible speeds. The Mosquito rolled, dived, weaved. The wooden skin creaked under stress, but it held. Behind them, the Luftwaffe scrambled night fighters, Ju-88s, Bf-110s, even a few desperate Me-109s pressed into interception duty. But the Mosquito was already gone. By the time radar found their altitude, they were halfway to the North Sea. In Berlin, Göring's broadcast had been interrupted. His microphone had gone dead for 5 long seconds as the explosions thundered in the distance. Witnesses said he stood frozen, his jowls trembling with rage before shouting at his aides, "That damned wooden plane! How can they fly over Berlin with plywood?" The next day, German newspapers were forbidden from mentioning the raid. But in the corridors of the Air Ministry, the word Mosquito carried the taste of shame. Göring himself would later tell his adjutants, "When I see a Mosquito, I get angry. Every time I think about it, I grind my teeth." Back at RAF Whiten, Harris and Sizemore climbed down from their aircraft to a quiet crowd. Ground crew stared in disbelief. The Mosquito's pale wooden surface was unscathed, save for a single scorch mark on the tail. The mission report was short, clinical, but the legend was already spreading. Over the next months, Mosquito squadrons struck again and again. Daylight raids on Gestapo headquarters in Oslo and The Hague. Pinpoint attacks on prison walls to free captured resistance fighters. Precision strikes that left surrounding neighborhoods untouched. Each time, the Luftwaffe scrambled. Each time the Mosquito outran them, the aircraft's very existence became a psychological weapon. Radar operators would hear the distinctive twin-engine frequency and shout warnings across the network. "Ghost approaching!" But it was always too late. The Mosquito wasn't designed to destroy cities. It was designed to destroy confidence. It made a mockery of German air defense, slipping through radar nets and fighter patrols with casual indifference. In late 1943, the RAF decided to send a message even louder than bombs. A pair of Mosquitoes from No. 105 Squadron flew another raid over Berlin. This time, precisely timed to disrupt a speech by Joseph Goebbels. As the Nazi propaganda minister stepped to the podium, explosions echoed outside the Reich Chancellery, rattling windows and scattering. The crowd, the propaganda machine that once boasted of German invincibility, now stood in silence, drowned out by a wooden bomber built by furniture makers and dreamers. When the Mosquitoes returned to England that night, their landing lights cut through the fog, glowing faintly against the wet tarmac. Their crews were exhausted, eyes rimmed red but grinning. They had done what no one thought possible. For the first time in the war, the Luftwaffe was no longer feared. It was mocked, and it wasn't by a fleet of heavy bombers or armored squadrons. It was by two men in a machine of wood and glue, cutting through the sky faster than arrogance could catch. May 2nd, 1945, Northern Germany. The war was ending, though no one dared say it aloud. The skies were quieter now. Fewer contrails, fewer engines, fewer desperate men chasing each other through the clouds. Over a countryside torn by years of flame and thunder, a single de Havilland Mosquito, PR Mecca 13th, silver and pale against the morning haze, flew one last reconnaissance pass. The pilot, Flight Lieutenant Peter Howard, was 24 years old and bone-tired. His co-pilot, Sergeant Bill Kent, leaned over the camera controls, snapping the final photographs of the war, bridges, convoys, rail lines, nothing more than records for history's filing cabinet. Below them, columns of German soldiers marched west with their hands raised, surrendering to the Americans. The Reich was crumbling, but the Mosquito still flew, fast, smooth, uncatchable. Howard looked out across the gray expanse and thought of every flight before this one, of Pickard's doomed raid, of Thompson's dive over the Channel, of the laughter that once echoed in German hangars when they'd heard of a wooden plane. Now those same engineers were burning their papers, watching their factories fall silent. In one captured test facility near Augsburg, British officers found pieces of a Mosquito, sections of the fuselage meticulously measured, its wooden layers peeled apart like scripture. Notes scrawled in the margins read, "Unmöglich leicht," und stark zugleich, impossible light, and strong at the same time. It was the Luftwaffe's final admission of defeat, not to sheer numbers or firepower, but to an idea, because the Mosquito had never truly been a bomber or a fighter or a scout. It was all of them and more. It was the embodiment of British resourcefulness, the notion that simplicity, executed perfectly, could make mockery of might. By war's end, the Mosquito had flown in nearly every theater, stalking Japanese shipping in Burma, mapping the fjords of Norway, striking at Gestapo prisons, intercepting V-1 rockets over the Channel, and racing over Berlin faster than any fighter could follow. It carried cameras, bombs, rockets, and occasionally even passengers, VIPs and spies, ferried in silence across occupied Europe. The RAF crews loved her because she looked after them. Ground crews adored her because she was easy to mend, and the enemy feared her because she was never there long enough to shoot at. When peace came, the Mosquito didn't vanish. It continued flying into the 1950s, mapping the new Cold War frontiers, flying research missions, even setting speed records. Its design inspired generations of aircraft, from the English electric Canberra to the early jets that followed. But for the men who flew her, the legend was personal. At RAF Whiten, veterans would gather years later, standing in front of the last surviving Mosquito in polished RAF livery. The varnish still gleamed faintly, the pale birch skin smooth under their fingertips. To a passerby, it might have looked fragile, a museum piece from another era, but to them it was alive. "Do you remember the sound?" one of them would whisper. "The way the Merlin sang when you opened her up?" And another, smiling faintly, would say, "You could feel it in your chest, like flying a heartbeat." They'd talk about the raids, the narrow escapes, the smell of glue and oil that filled the cockpit. And sometimes, when the conversation quieted, one of them would quote Geoffrey de Havilland's words, the ones that had once sounded like madness. "The greatest protection is speed. If you are fast enough, you do not need armor." The Mosquito proved it true, not just in engineering but in spirit. It was never about what it was made of, but about what it refused to be limited by. Across the Channel, in the ruins of Germany, Göring's boast, "No enemy aircraft will ever fly over the Reich," lay in ashes. The mosquito had flown over it again and again, taunting, photographing, bombing, and vanishing into the clouds. It had turned plywood into power, glue into glory, and mockery into myth. In the final tally, the wooden wonder didn't just outrun every Luftwaffe fighter. It outran arrogance itself, the kind that believed strength could only be measured in metal and guns. And so, when the last mosquito throttled back its engines and rolled to a stop at the end of a quiet runway, the air fell still. The war had ended, but the sound of those merlins seemed to linger in the wind, a ghostly hum over the empty fields, a whisper of wood, speed, and defiance.